Yeah, I should start actually by explaining my my massive conflicts of interest. I'm representing Scientists for Global Responsibility right now. The next session I'm going to be representing ForcesWatch, who I'm also a member of the steering committee of. Anne knows from Campaigning Against the Arms Trade, I'm a member of their steering committee, and my day job is something completely different about corruption as well. So, so for what it's worth, this is about the security angle of my work. So, Scientists for Global Responsibility commissioned me to do a study on the UK's militaristic approach to research and technology, science and technology, and its impact on its security policy. So, it came out about 2 weeks ago. It's called Offensive Insecurity. There are executive summaries sitting outside, and I actually have a number of copies of the full report for anyone who'd like it, but please make sure you actually want to read it, because it costs us quite a lot of money to print them. How do we go? There we go. So our questions was, when you think about UK security policy, what does the UK government regard as its main security threats? Why do we care? Well, because the UK government, A, has the resources and distributes the most resources that will affect our security in the future, also affects the public discourse. The public's understanding of security is largely driven by government policy. When the government says you have to have nuclear weapons, about half the population will just accept that that's true. And so it's the biggest driver of the security discourse in the UK. And then following on from that, where does the UK actually invest to ensure its security in the long term? And the best way we saw to analyse that is its spending on research and technology, research and development. That's important not only because research and development and the scientists who do that work are a limited resource. There's only so many and they only have so much time and money to do these things. And also because what we are engaging in by way of technological solutions to security problems, solutions or ways to mitigate these problems, will affect our approach to those issues for decades to come. And a lot of the big problems we face now need to be solved, or at least addressed and understood and developed and find solutions to or mitigations to now through research and development in order to hopefully have an answer to those problems decades down the line. And the last point is where actually should the UK be spending their money, and from looking at our own perception of where we should think they should be spending that money, how much are they actually spending on those things? So the first job is to look at the UK's security policy as it stands. There's a whole range of documents, one or two have been mentioned already today, and there's different parts within the UK government and specifically the Ministry of Defence that analyse these things. So the first is the Defence Concepts and Doctrine Centre, who publish a really quite good publication called The Strategic Trends, and they do it in a roughly 30-year time span. The last one was out to 2040, the next one will be 2045. So they look at security threats to the UK quite long term. The second interesting document that's worth looking at is the National Security Risk Assessment that the UK government commissioned in preparation for the last two, the National Security Strategy and the Strategic Defence and Security Review. Now this is quite important. This happened in 2010, just at the start of this government, really. And the UK government is acknowledging, which it hasn't always in the past, that the security landscape the UK faces is radically different to the one it faced a few decades ago. The Cold War has ended, and in the words of Cameron and Clegg, who signed at least the foreword to the National Security Strategy, they said, "The UK is more secure than in most of her long history, in the sense that we do not currently face, as we have so often in our past, a conventional threat of attack on our territory by a hostile power." And they also broadened out, much more than it has been done in the past, their analysis of wider security threats. So, for example, the DCDC, Defence Concepts and Doctrine Centre's report, considers climate change as a ring road issue, as they called it, one of the main drivers of conflicts in the years to come. Energy and resource insecurity, they acknowledge, as a main driver of the security threats in our world, and so on. And as I say, they look quite long term. The next one, however, gets progressively worse. So the National Security Risk Assessment, which was published as part of the National Security Strategy, gave the various threats the UK faces in 3 tiers. Tier 1 has things like terrorism, cyber attacks, and major accidents and natural hazards, which require some kind of national response, and then also includes things like an international military crisis that would draw in the UK, but not, it should be noted, one that involves NATO or EU, something that the UK is obliged by treaty to actually get involved with. It goes on with threats of chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear weapons, civil wars overseas that could bring in the UK, organised crime, radioactive releases from nuclear sites, etc., etc. But what's actually very interesting about this is that of the main threats, the top 2 tiers, only 2 of those issues can be responded to with can be dealt with in any way by military force. That's an international crisis that draws in the UK, but as we say, doesn't involve an allies, doesn't involve something we have to be involved with. And the second point is, again, an intervention to do with allies. Both of these are essentially wars of choice. The UK, in its policy, acknowledges we don't face a threat to the UK. There is no national defence threat. It is purely an outward need to intervene elsewhere in the world, to be an interventionist power. All the other major threats we face cannot be dealt with military force. Then the Strategic Defence and Security Review is the thing that actually determined where the money got spent, and they didn't have any time frame on their analysis. In fact, their analysis was basically the last war, or possibly the Cold War. And so the main discourse you may remember from when this happened was, how many aircraft carriers should we have, 1 or 2? Should we have 3 or 4 Trident submarines, which is something that's going on? A very radical idea would be to have 2. This kind of terribly advanced radical thinking about security that really doesn't get us anywhere, and basically just decided whether we should have, what number of tanks or aircraft we should actually buy.
2 minutes fine.
Okay, so what we actually found looking into this is we classified, based on the idea of non-offensive security, the idea that you can qualitatively disarm, you can choose different military equipment based on what your actual needs are, what basis the UK spends its money on research and development. The big blue section is the offensive weaponry. The little red and little green sections are defensive and general, and we're quite generous with what we class as defensive and general, I should note. It's also worth bearing in mind that the UK military does not keep records of what £500 million per year, what it spends on, with £500 million per year by projects, so you don't know what projects that research and development spending is going to. Biggest things, you can see these are the largest projects they spent on: combat aircraft, combat helicopters, submarines, and associated things that are basically used for nuclear weapons. Unmanned aerial vehicles sneak in with nearly 200 million. This is over a 3-year period. And then a few other things at the bottom, long-range transport. And the first one that has any defensive role is the Nimrod marine patrol aircraft, which is basically used to patrol the oceans, and they cancelled that. So, so we then compared this to what we think the best way, the biggest security issues are over the next few decades. We used a theory called sustainable security theory that was brought forward by the Oxford Research Group a few years ago, and they thought that the greatest drivers and the greatest things we need to prevent and address to create security in the long term, not by going overseas and dealing with terrorism by fighting terrorists and killing terrorists, which is a bit counterproductive, but actually preventing the need for conflict in the first place, is climate change, competition over resources, marginalisation of the majority world, and global militarisation, particularly issues like proliferation, which we could lump things like the arms trade into, as well as nuclear weapon disarmament and all that kind of thing. So we looked at what research and development spending is actually done to address those issues. What you get is this. So on the left we have the big high tower, and the dark bit at the bottom is the offensive weapons. And on the right we have all the all the research and development spending and all those other issues. Again, we're really quite generous with how we calculated that. Anything to do with development overseas, aid-related R&D is included. And you can see on the right, the top bit, that's much larger, is Research Council, and the bottom bit is direct government funding. Research councils under the Haldane Principle direct their own money. And so clearly academics have the right idea and are seeing some of these security issues as big issues to deal with, the government less so. And that tiny box at the bottom compared to all the military spending is quite striking as to where the government directs its science spending. The headline comparisons is over 3 years the UK government spent £1.5 billion for combat areas, nearly £1 billion for long-range submarines and their nuclear weapons that are associated with it. And in comparison over those 3 years, for all their research and development spending on international development was £626 million and only £180 million, give or take, for renewable energy that we found.
Which 3 years?
Sorry, it was 2008 to 2011. So I'll just leave you with this thing. I just like putting this picture in every single presentation I can have. It's, if you can see, it's a lot of Chinese soldiers on Segway machines holding their guns. The point being, there's real questions as to what we think real security comes from. Clearly the Chinese government thought this was a great idea. I think this was just before the Olympics. Big vehicles with people holding guns and shooting at things is not security by definition. Those remarkable disparities in spending and what we actually regard as the major threats should be very worrying, because that is how not only our resources are spent, but also it's how people's perceptions are directed through it. If they think that this makes security, then that's going to continue. If you can change their idea that they can have security, or you can use a different discourse that moves away from security, but a non-militarized view of the way to make themselves safe, then you might actually have some real security at some point and not waste your money on this stuff. Anyway, thank you very much.